A vast dark sea existed before time itself began. This is where the Celtic creation story starts, in a silent void waiting for its first gods. By the end of our journey, you will understand how this emptiness transformed into the mythic landscape of Ireland, ruled by deities of immense power and complex destiny. We will discover why these gods were forced to retreat beneath the hills and how a king's silver arm decided the fate of a nation. What part of a world born from chaos intrigues you the most? This nothingness was not simply an empty room. It was the complete absence of a room, the absence of walls, of a floor, even of the idea of up or down. Celtic cosmology speaks of a primordial void, a formless expanse often envisioned as a vast, dark, and silent sea. There was no light to define shape, no sound to break the stillness, and crucially, no time to measure change. Imagine a canvas that is not just blank, but one where the very concept of paint does not yet exist. This is the stage upon which the first act of creation would play out. Unlike other traditions that begin with a giant or a cosmic egg, the Celtic story starts with pure potential, a deep and patient mystery waiting in the dark. The suspense lies in the question of what or who could possibly stir in such absolute stillness. What force could first conceive of something as simple as a horizon or as profound as a thought? From that profound stillness, a presence finally emerged. To understand the true first gods of Celtic myth, we must look not to the famous Tuatha Dé Danann, but to what came before them. The Tuatha Dé Danann, whose name means the people or the tribe of the goddess Danu, are the dazzling pantheon most associated with Irish mythology. They are the masters of magic, the rulers of the Otherworld, beings of radiant power and deep wisdom. Yet their spectacular arrival on the shores of Ireland, which we will explore, is not the true beginning. They are inheritors stepping onto a stage prepared by older, more fundamental forces. Their mother, or perhaps their ancestral source, is the goddess Danu herself. She is a figure shrouded in the mists of the deepest past, often interpreted as a primordial mother goddess. Her essence is linked to the land, to fertility, and to the life-giving flow of rivers. The great river Danube in Europe is sometimes thought to bear her name, a testament to her ancient and widespread reverence. Danu represents the foundational womb from which a divine dynasty would spring. So while her children, the Tuatha Dé Danann, become the principal gods of the stories, they point back to a more elemental origin. The first Celtic gods are not merely personalities with names and titles. They are the raw, deified principles that had to exist before any tribe could walk the earth. They are the very concepts of sovereignty, of chaos, of the untamed wild, and of the land itself. To meet them is to understand the bedrock upon which all later myths were built. This layered origin story reaches us through a fascinating and complex filter. To truly grasp the Celtic creation myths, we must first understand the books that carried them through time. Our primary sources are not ancient stone tablets inscribed by Druids, but medieval manuscripts painstakingly copied by hand in monastic scriptoria across Ireland. The most important of these is the Leba Gabala Eren, often called the Book of Invasions. This text is not a single, straightforward story, but a sweeping pseudo-history that weaves together mythology, legend, and biblical genealogy to explain how Ireland was populated through a series of 6 legendary takings or invasions. It is within this framework that we find the arrival of the Tuatha Dé Danann. Another key collection is what scholars later termed the mythological cycle, a body of stories focused specifically on the deeds of these godlike beings before the coming of humans. Now, here is the crucial point. These manuscripts were compiled centuries after Ireland had converted to Christianity, written by learned monks who were both preservers and interpreters of their island's deep past. They were not pagan priests recording pure doctrine. This means the myths we have were filtered through a Christian worldview. the monks often sought to fit the old gods into a historical or biblical timeline, sometimes casting them as ancient, powerful kings rather than outright deities. This is why the Celtic creation narrative can feel less linear and systematic than, say, the Greek stories from Hesiod or the Norse tales from the Eddas. We are not getting a pristine theological document. We are hearing echoes of a much older oral tradition, remembered and reshaped for a new world. The result is a tapestry where magic and history intertwine, where gods walk the earth as superhuman figures, and where the profound mystery of the world's beginning is preserved in fragments, waiting to be pieced together. So this is where the story of the takings truly begins, not with gods, but with a figure who bridges two worlds. The first legendary arrival in the Book of Invasions is a woman named Cessair. She is described as the granddaughter of Noah, who built the ark. This detail is our clearest signpost of the monk's hand at work, stitching the deep pagan past of Ireland into the familiar tapestry of biblical history. It is a fascinating act of syncretism, an attempt to make the island's ancient origins fit within a newly Christian understanding of the world's timeline. Cessair, fleeing the coming great flood that Noah would survive, leads a group of 50 women and 3 men to the western edge of the known world, to the empty, green shores of Ireland. Their time there is brief and ultimately tragic. When the deluge finally engulfs the earth, it washes over Ireland as well. All but one of Cessair's party perishes, cleansing the land completely. This first failed attempt is profoundly important. It establishes the rhythmic pattern that all the following myths will follow, a cycle of arrival, struggle, and eventual displacement. Ireland is presented not as a land with a single, eternal people, but as a prize to be won, lost, and won again through successive waves. Each new group must contend with the legacy, and sometimes the lingering presence of those who came before. Cessair's story, though brief and tinged with biblical doom, sets the stage for this epic rhythm of conquest. It tells us that from the very start, this land was a destination for those seeking refuge, a new beginning, or a kingdom of their own. With the slate wiped clean by the floodwaters, the stage is now empty, waiting for the next far more powerful actors to make their entrance. Who or what could possibly follow a cleansing of such biblical scale? After the floodwaters receded, Ireland lay silent once more, a fertile blank slate for 300 years. Then came the second wave, led by a man named Partholón. He arrived from the distant east, a chieftain leading his people across the sea to claim this empty land. While Partholón and his followers were not deities like the Tuatha Dé Danann who would come later, they were mythic giants, the first true shapers of the island's physical and social landscape. Their story is one of foundational creation shadowed by inevitable doom. Under Partholón's rule, the wilderness began to recede. His people performed the first great acts of civilization, clearing 4 vast plains so that grass could grow and livestock could graze. They dug the first lake, created the first forge for smelting metal, and perhaps most importantly, established the first code of laws and the first brewing of ale. They were making a home, imposing human order upon the raw, untamed world. But in Celtic myth, creation is always balanced by a dark counterpart. For Partholón's people, this shadow took the form of the Fomorians. These were not a rival tribe in any ordinary sense. The Fomorians were monstrous, chaotic beings, often depicted with mismatched limbs, one eye, and a malevolent connection to the wild, destructive forces of nature. They represented the primordial chaos that civilization must constantly fight to hold back. The battle that erupted between Partholón's settlers and the Fomorians was the first conflict ever fought on Irish soil, a symbolic war between order and chaos. Partholón's people won, but their victory was not eternal. After flourishing for generations, their entire community was struck down by a sudden, devastating plague. In a single week, every last one of them perished, leaving the land empty again. This complete and utter annihilation cemented a haunting pattern that would echo through every subsequent cycle of Irish myth. Arrival, flourishing, and then total destruction. Each wave of inhabitants builds upon the ruins of the last, only to become ruins themselves. The story of Partholón teaches us that in this mythology, no victory is permanent and no civilization is destined to last. The land itself seems to consume its children, waiting patiently for the next claimants to its green fields. With Partholón's people gone, who could possibly dare to settle a land with such a fatal curse? The silence after the plague was broken by the sails of a new people. Their leader was Nemed, whose name means sacred or holy, and his arrival marks the third great taking of Ireland. Like Partholón before him, Nemed led his followers from the distant east to settle the empty, fertile land. They came with hope, establishing themselves and beginning the hard work of building a home. They cleared 12 great plains from the dense forest, and Nemed himself is credited with constructing 2 legendary royal forts, symbols of order and sovereignty rising from the wilderness. But the shadow that haunted Partholón's people only grew darker and more defined. The Fomorians, those monstrous embodiments of chaos, had not vanished. They watched from their offshore strongholds and from the darkest corners of the land, and they imposed a terrible rule. Each year, on the Feast of Samhain, when the veil between worlds was thinnest, the Nemedians were forced to pay a crippling tribute. They had to give 2/3 of their children, their wheat, and their milk to the Fomorian kings. This was not merely a tax, it was a systematic draining of their future, a ritual sacrifice to the forces of chaos to buy a fragile peace. The oppression became unbearable. Nemed, in a final, desperate act of defiance, rallied his people and attacked the primary Fomorian fortress. In a fierce and brutal battle, they succeeded in capturing it. But victory was fleeting. The Fomorians, led by their king, summoned a terrible wave to crash upon the land. The waters swept over the fortress, drowning Nemed and the vast majority of his people. Only a single ship of survivors escaped the cataclysm, scattering to the winds. This story deepens the core conflict immeasurably. It is no longer just a battle between settlers and monsters, but a grinding cycle of subjugation and doomed rebellion. The Fomorians are now clearly established as the eternal antagonists, the crushing weight of blind, natural fury against which all attempts at civilization must struggle. Nemed's tragic end reinforces the land's cruel pattern, but his scattered survivors carry a seed of destiny. They fled to the corners of the world, and from their lineages, the next 2 waves of invaders would eventually arise. The stage is now set for a return, but next time the claimants will not be merely human. They will be something far closer to gods. The scattered descendants of Nemed's people would return to claim their ancestral home, but they came changed by the world. These were the Fir Bolg, the men of the bags, and their name hints at a history of hardship. Legend says one group of Nemed's survivors fled to Greece, where they were enslaved and forced to carry bags of soil to farm the rocky hills. When they finally escaped, they did not come as refugees, but as a hardened people carrying the very earth of their oppression with them. They sailed back to Ireland not as magical beings, but as determined settlers. Their strength was not in enchantment, but in sheer resilience and a profound, practical connection to the land itself. Upon arrival, they did something no previous invaders had accomplished. They established a lasting, organized society. The Fir Bolg divided the island into 5 coherent provinces, what the texts call coist, meaning a fifth. This was the first true political mapping of Ireland, creating the foundational provinces of Ulster, Connacht, Leinster, Munster, and the central province of Meath, which served as the seat of the High King. This act of division was an act of creation, imposing a human, understandable order upon the wild geography. They established the institution of sacred kingship, where the ruler's legitimacy was directly tied to the health and fertility of the land. A just king meant bountiful harvests, a weak king brought blight and misfortune. The Fir Bolg mastered the practical arts of agriculture, fortification, and law. They were sturdy, earthly, and powerful in a profoundly human way. They represent the old order, the age of heroes and chieftains who rule through strength, wisdom, and a direct covenant with the soil. Their island was a place of clear boundaries, tangible power, and mortal struggle. They had faced the Fomorians in battle and for a time held them at bay, securing their hard-won kingdom. For 37 years they ruled in this way, their reign seeming stable and permanent, but their very success set the stage for a collision of worlds. They had created a kingdom worthy of a legend, a prize of immense value, and now, from across the misty sea, a new power was approaching, one that did not work the land but commanded it. The Fir Bolg, masters of the earthly realm, were about to meet a people for whom the earth itself was an instrument of magic. Their reign ended not with a shout but with a silent, impossible fog. On the 1st of May, the festival of Beltane, a great mist descended upon the western coasts of Ireland. It did not drift in from the sea like any natural weather, but appeared as a palpable darkness, a magical obscuration that hid the horizon and muffled all sound. From within this supernatural veil, the Tuatha Dé Danann made their entrance. Some accounts say they arrived in ships, then burned their own vessels so the smoke mingled with the mist, creating a permanent screen between their coming and the world they left behind. Others, more fantastically, claim they descended from the sky, landing upon the mountain peaks. However they came, their arrival was an act of profound mystery and power. They were not like the Fir Bolg. They did not carry bags of soil or clear plains with axes. They carried magic in their hands and destiny in their hearts. This was the moment the mythic scale of Ireland's story shifted irrevocably from the age of heroic mortals to the era of the gods themselves. The Tuatha Dé Danann were a complete race of beings, a society of deities. They were masters of every high art, blending what we would separate into science, magic, and craftsmanship into a single, luminous discipline called Draoch. They could shape-shift, control the weather, heal mortal wounds, and cast illusions so potent they became reality. Their wisdom was immense, and their beauty was said to be dazzling, otherworldly. But they did not come empty-handed. They brought with them 4 legendary artifacts, the 4 treasures of the Tuatha Dé, each one a symbol of their sovereignty and a source of their power. From the northern city of failures, they brought the Stone of Fall, the Lugh Fail. This was no ordinary rock, it was the Stone of Destiny. When the true High King of Ireland would place his foot upon it, the stone would roar its approval, a sound that echoed across the land to confirm his rightful rule. From Gorias in the east came the Spear of Lugh. In the hands of the sun god for whom it was named, this spear was unstoppable in battle, and its tip was so fierce it had to be kept submerged in a cauldron of water to prevent it from bursting into flames. From the southern city of Phineas came the Sword of Nuada. This was a weapon of justice, one that could not be sheathed once drawn until it had tasted blood, and from whose stroke no enemy could ever escape. And finally, from the northern city of Murias, they brought the Cauldron of the Dagda. This was the vessel of endless plenty, belonging to the great father god, the Dagda. No company ever went away from it unsatisfied, for it could produce an endless supply of nourishing food. With these treasures, they were not just another tribe seeking land. They were a divine collective arriving to claim a kingdom worthy of their majesty. Their presence transformed the very nature of the conflict to come. The impending battle would no longer be a simple struggle for territory between 2 groups of powerful mortals. It would be a cosmic contest, a clash between the old, earthly order of the Fir Bolg and the new, magical sovereignty of the gods. The Fir Bolg, looking out from their well-ordered provinces, saw not an army of men, but a living mist advancing, within which gleamed the light of impossible artifacts and the silhouettes of beings who commanded the elements. The question hanging in the air was no longer about who would rule the plains, but what kind of world would rule Ireland itself. Would it remain a land of human law and seasonal toil, or would it become an enchanted realm, a piece of the otherworld made manifest on earth? The stage was set for a war that would decide the soul of the island. The Fir Bolg sent their champion Esreng to parley with the approaching mist. What he saw emerging from the gloom must have chilled his blood. The Tuatha Dé Danann were not like any warriors he had ever known. Their armor shone with a strange light, and their weapons seemed to hum with a power of their own. Yet, in a moment that defines the honor of this first great mythic war, the Tuatha Dé offered a choice. They could fight with equal weapons, a fair contest of strength and skill, or they could unleash their full magical might and sweep the Fir Bolg from the field in an instant. The Fir Bolg king, Eachad mac Aiach, chose the path of honor. He demanded a fair fight, a battle of champions on an open plain. This decision set the stage for the first battle of Mag Tuaird, a clash not of sorcery against steel, but of two sovereign peoples for the soul of the land. The battle itself was a titanic, day-long struggle. The earth shook under the feet of the combatants, and the din of clashing weapons was said to be heard across the sea. At its heart was a legendary single combat between the champions Esreng of the Fir Bolg and Nuada of the Tuatha Dé. Nuada, the king of the gods, wielded his unerring sword of light. Esreng fought with a massive, brutal shield and a spear that had tasted the blood of monsters. In a devastating exchange, Esreng's spear struck true, shearing off Nuada's right arm at the shoulder. But even wounded, Nuada's sword flashed, and with a single stroke he cleaved Esreng's shield in two. The combat ended in a stalemate of mutual respect, but the tide of the wider battle had turned. The Tuatha Dé Danann, with their superior skill and the terrifying power of Lugh's spear, pressed their advantage. The Fir Bolg fought with desperate, earth-shaking valor, but they were ultimately overwhelmed. Their reign was broken, yet in victory the Tuatha Dé showed a remarkable grace. They offered the defeated Fir Bolg 1/5 of the island, the province of Connacht, to rule in peace. Esreng himself chose to take his people and depart for distant islands, his honor intact. The gods had won the day, but their triumph was immediately shadowed by a grave problem. King Nuada, their leader, was now maimed. Under the ancient law of sacred kingship, a ruler who bore a physical blemish could not hold the throne. A king must be whole, a perfect symbol of the land's vitality. Nuada, the hero of the battle, was forced to step down. This created a vacuum, a crisis of leadership at the very moment of their greatest victory. To solve it, the Tuatha Dé turned to a compromise candidate, a young prince named Brez, whose name meant beautiful. His mother was a woman of the Tuatha Dé, but his father was a king of the Fomorians, those ancient enemies of order. Brez was chosen for his stunning appearance and his promise of peace through this alliance with the old enemy. He was, they thought, a perfect bridge between two worlds, but a king who is chosen for his beauty and his political connections rather than his strength or justice is a dangerous gamble. And so, with the Fir Bolg defeated and the wounded Nuada retreating to heal, a new and flawed king ascended. The Tuatha Dé Danann now ruled Ireland, but their reign began under a cloud of uncertainty, with a half-Fomorian king on the throne and their true king nursing a wound that seemed to spell the end of his destiny. But destiny in these myths is never so simple. A silversmith was already at work, and a new arm was being forged. Brez the Beautiful now sat upon the throne, but the true source of the Tuatha Dé Danann's power rested not with their king, but within 4 sacred objects. These were the 4 treasures brought with them from across the sea, and they represented the unbreakable pillars of their divine sovereignty. Each treasure was more than a weapon or a tool. It was a physical manifestation of a fundamental principle of rule. Their origins trace back to 4 legendary cities of the north, Phalias and Murias, and of the south, Gorias and Finias. These were not places on any human map, but citadels of the Otherworld, schools of the highest magic and craftsmanship. From these mystical academies, the gods acquired the instruments of their destiny. The first from the northern city of Phalias was the Stone of Fall, the Lugh Fail. This was the stone of destiny planted on the sacred hill of Tara. It was the ultimate arbiter of kingship. When the true High King of Ireland placed his foot upon it, the stone would let out a mighty roar that echoed across the provinces, a supernatural confirmation of his rightful rule. It did not respond to strength or beauty alone, but to a deeper, inherent quality of justice and harmony with the land itself. It was the voice of the sovereignty of Ireland, speaking only for the worthy. From the southern city of Gorias came the spear of Lugh. This weapon, belonging to the master of all arts, was a symbol of unstoppable martial power and fierce, focused energy. In battle, it was said that none could stand against the one who wielded it, but its power was so immense it required constant control. Legend says its tip had to be kept cooled in a cauldron of poppy seeds to keep it from bursting into flames of its own accord. It represented the devastating, precise force a king must command to defend his realm. From Phineas in the south came the sword of Nuada. This was the weapon of justice and inescapable retribution. Once it was drawn from its sheath in anger, it could not be returned until it had tasted blood. More importantly, no one could escape a blow struck by this sword, and no one could resist its swing. It was the embodiment of the law's final word, a guarantee that wrongs would be answered and order would be upheld. It made the king's judgment absolute. And finally, from the northern city of Murias came the cauldron of the Dagda. This vessel, belonging to the great good god, the father figure of the pantheon, was the symbol of endless generosity and security. No company ever went away from it hungry or unsatisfied. It produced a boundless supply of nourishing food, ensuring the prosperity and well-being of the people. A king who possessed this cauldron guaranteed that his reign would be one of plenty, where no subject would know want. Together, these treasures created a complete picture of perfect kingship, the divine right to rule confirmed by the land, enforced by invincible arms and blessed with endless abundance. While the flawed Brez occupied the throne, these objects remained in the hands of the gods, a silent reminder of the true, majestic order he could never embody. Their very existence was a promise and a threat that the current imbalance could not last. The reign of Brez began with a promise of peace, but it curdled into something far darker. Here was a king chosen for his beauty and his bloodline, a bridge between the Tuatha Dé Danann and their ancient Fomorian foes. Yet a bridge by its nature belongs fully to neither side, and Brez proved to be a ruler without a true home in his heart. His physical perfection masked a deep spiritual flaw. He lacked the one quality the gods valued above all others, the sacred duty of a sovereign generosity. In the Celtic world, a king's worth was measured by his open-handedness, his ability to ensure the prosperity of his people. The king's hall was to be a place of warmth, music, and endless feasting, where no poet left without a gift and no warrior went thirsty. Brez violated this sacred contract utterly. He imposed crushing tributes upon the Tuatha Dé themselves, demanding their labor and their wealth to enrich his own holdings. The gods, masters of the land, found themselves forced to build fortresses, to dig trenches, and to perform menial tasks under the watchful eyes of Brez's Fomorian advisors. The great Dagda, the good god of abundance, was sent on errands to build a massive fort, given only a meager portion of porridge for his toil. The legendary physician Dian Sate was ordered to sweep the hearth. This was more than mere labor, it was a calculated humiliation, a deliberate inversion of the natural order where the gods were reduced to servants in their own kingdom. The poet Kerber, son of the goddess of poetry, came to Brez's hall expecting the traditional welcome. He was given a small, dark chamber and a meal so paltry and ill-prepared it became a legendary insult. In response, Kerber did not draw a sword, he crafted a satire, a poem of such withering power that it left blemishes on Brez's face. This was the ultimate consequence, a king's inner corruption made visible on his skin. The beautiful king was now blemished both in spirit and in appearance. His rule had drained the life from the land, the herds grew thin, and the people's strength waned. The Tuatha Dé Danann, who had crossed oceans in a mist of magic, now found themselves oppressed in their own home by a king who was, in every way that mattered, a hollow crown. Their patience, however, was not endless, and their true king was waiting in the wings, now bearing an arm forged not of flesh but of silver. Into this grim twilight of oppression, a new light appeared at the gates of Tara. His name was Lugh, and he arrived not with an army, but with a single, audacious demand to see the king. The young guard at the royal fort, following the custom of the time, asked him what skill he brought to the court of the Tuatha Dé Danann. For you see, no one was admitted to the hall of the gods unless they possessed a master craft. Lugh's answer began a litany that would become legendary. "Are you a blacksmith?" the god asked. "I am," said Lugh. "Are you a champion warrior?" "I am that also." "A harpist?" "Yes." "A poet, a historian, a physician, a cupbearer, a silversmith?" To each question, Lugh gave the same simple, confident reply: "I am." The bewildered god finally went to the king himself, reporting that a young man stood outside who claimed mastery of every single art. The king, intrigued, allowed Lugh to enter. Inside the hall, Lugh did not boast, he demonstrated. He played the harp so beautifully it moved the assembly from tears of sorrow to tears of joy. He matched the king's best chess player move for move. He displayed feats of strength and hurling that left the warriors in awe. He proved his knowledge of history, law, and magic. He was, in every conceivable way, the master of all arts, the complete champion. The Tuatha Dé Danann gave him a new name on the spot, Lugh Lugh of the long arm, for the far-reaching grasp of his skills, and more importantly, Ildanak, the skilled one. Here was the antithesis of King Brez. Where Brez was beautiful but hollow, Lugh was radiant with competence. Where Brez hoarded and oppressed, Lugh's very presence promised abundance and justice. He did not ask for a position, he earned it through undeniable, multifaceted excellence. The gods, languishing under their half-Fomorian king, saw in Lugh their deliverer. He was the spark they had been waiting for, a leader whose wisdom could outthink their enemies, whose strength could match them in battle, and whose artistic soul could restore the honor and joy of their realm. In Lugh, the ideal of sacred kingship was no longer a memory, but a living, breathing man standing in their hall. His arrival signaled that the season of humiliation was over, and the time to reclaim their destiny had finally come. The only question that remained was how a new king, even one as skilled as Lugh, could be crowned when the throne was still occupied. The answer would require not just a challenge, but a revolution. The tension could not hold. With Lugh's arrival, the Tuatha Dé Danann found their resolve. They gathered in council and formally deposed the despised King Brez, casting him out from Tara. He fled not into exile, but straight to the fortress of his Fomorian kin, to the grim towers of the ancient enemy. There he poured his bitterness into the ear of his grandfather, the most terrifying of the Fomorians, Balor of the Evil Eye. This was no longer a dispute over tribute. It was a declaration of total war between two cosmic principles. The Tuatha Dé Danann, the gods of order, skill, and sacred law, would face the Fomorians, the primordial embodiments of chaos, sterility, and brute force. The second battle of Mag Tuaid was inevitable, a final reckoning for the soul of Ireland. Preparations began in earnest, blending profound magic with practical cunning. The Dagda, the good god, was sent as a spy to the Fomorian camp on the eve of Samhain. He found them in a grim valley, cooking a gruel of milk, flour, fat, goats, and swine in a cavernous pit. To mock him, they forced the Dagda to eat the entire contents, enough to feed a legion, scraping the pit clean with a giant ladle so large it left grooves in the earth. Stuffed and lumbering, his belly swollen like a cauldron, the Dagda then seduced the Fomorian war goddess, extracting from her the secrets of their battle plans. This seemingly grotesque feast was itself a potent act of magic, a consumption of the enemy's strength and a display of his own boundless capacity. Meanwhile, the great smith god Goibniu forged unbreakable spearheads with 3 strokes of his hammer. Dian Sate, the physician, prepared a healing well. He and his children would chant spells over the wounded, casting them into the waters to emerge whole by the next dawn. And the Morrigan, the terrifying goddess of war and fate, circled the battlefield alone. She chanted a fierce prophecy, a poem of coming bloodshed and ultimate victory, her words weaving destiny into the very soil. The air itself grew heavy with impending storm. When the armies finally met on the plain of Mag Tuatha, the clash was cataclysmic. The earth shook as two worlds collided. In the first hours, tragedy struck the Tuatha Dé. King Nuada, restored to wholeness with his silver arm, rode into the fray with his sword of light. He sought out the Fomorian champion and fought valiantly, but his restoration could not change his fate. He fell in combat, the rightful king slain before the battle was decided. His death sent a wave of despair through the gods' ranks, but the Dagda, embodying the stubborn, enduring strength of the land itself, waded into the thickest fighting. He wielded not an elegant sword, but a massive club so heavy it had to be dragged on wheels. With one end, he could slay 9 men with a single blow. With the other, he could touch the living and restore them to life. He fought like a force of nature, a bulwark against the crashing tide of chaos. The fate of all creation, however, hinged on a single, dreadful gaze. From the Fomorian lines emerged their ultimate weapon, Balor of the Evil Eye. This was no ordinary giant. His one great eye was kept sealed by 7 heavy lids, for its gaze was a weapon of absolute destruction. When his eyelid was hoisted open by his attendants, the eye would blaze with a poisonous, withering light that could annihilate an entire army where they stood. He was a living siege engine, a walking plague. The Tuatha Dé ranks wavered before this horror, but Lugh, the master of all arts, stepped forward. He could not meet that gaze directly. Instead, he used a sling, the weapon of a shepherd, and loaded it with a smooth stone. As Balor's monstrous eyelid began to creak open, as the first lethal rays began to seep out, Lugh let fly. The stone flew true, not striking the eye, but smashing through the socket itself. The force of the blow was so tremendous that it carried Balor's evil eye straight out through the back of his own skull, where its venomous gaze swept over the packed ranks of the advancing Fomorians. They fell not by the gods' hands, but by the weapon of their own king. With Balor's fall, the spirit broke in the Fomorian host, the battle turned, and the Tuatha Dé Danann drove their ancient enemies into the sea, scattering them to the winds and the remote islands forever. On that blood-soaked field, order had finally triumphed over chaos. The Tuatha Dé Danann stood victorious, the uncontested masters of Ireland. They had paid a terrible price, losing their noble king Nuada, but they had secured their sovereignty for an age. They buried their dead with honor, and the Dagda, in a final act of reclamation, took the Morrigan as his mate upon the very battlefield, a sacred union to heal the wounded land. The Second Battle of Mag Tuatha was not just a military victory, it was a cosmic reset. It established the gods' right to rule, cleansing the island of its primordial terror and setting the stage for a long, golden age of magic and prosperity. Yet, even in this moment of absolute triumph, a subtle shadow lingered. They had defeated the monsters from the sea, but a new kind of claimant was already stirring in the distant east, a people without magic, but with a relentless will of their own. The gods had won their world, but for how long could they keep it? Victory on the battlefield belonged to many, but the true foundation of the new age rested on the shoulders of a single, remarkable god. If the Tuatha Dé Danann were a pantheon, then the Dagda was its beating heart and its sturdy hearth. His name itself is telling, for Dagda means the good god, not in a moralistic sense, but as the ultimate provider, the one who is good for something. He was the father figure of the divine tribe, a deity whose power was not distant or aloof, but intimately woven into the very substance of life. In him, 3 essential roles fused into one formidable presence. He was a mighty warrior, a druid of profound magic, and the unchallengeable patriarch of his people. His strength was the anchor that held the community fast, but it was always expressed through instruments of abundance, not mere destruction. Take his most famous weapon, a club so massive it had to be hauled on a wheeled cart. This was no elegant blade. With one end, he could slay 9 men with a single earth-shaking blow. But with the other end, he could gently touch the fallen and restore them to life. In a single object, he held the power of death and regeneration, a perfect symbol of his nature as a guardian of the cycle of life itself. Then there was his cauldron, the Qua Ansik, which means the undry cauldron. This was no ordinary cooking pot. It was a vessel of limitless generosity from which no company ever left unsatisfied. In a world where hospitality was sacred law, the Dagda's cauldron guaranteed that under his care scarcity was impossible. It was the divine promise of a full belly and a secure home, the bedrock of social stability. His magic was equally grounded. He was a master druid who could control the seasons with the playing of his great oak harp. One melody would bring forth the lush bounty of summer, another would summon the necessary sleep of winter. His power was not about defying nature, but conducting it, ensuring the fertility of the land and the prosperity of the flocks. This deep connection to the earth made him a god of raw, primal fertility, associated with the soil, the harvest, and the vital forces of creation. Yet for all this cosmic power, the Dagda was remarkably, endearingly relatable. The myths paint him not as a stern, Olympian figure, but as a being of immense appetite and hearty humor. He is often depicted in a simple, rustic tunic that is too short for his great frame, sometimes humorously exposing his backside. His appetites were legendary, as shown in his visit to the Fomorian camp where he consumed a gargantuan pit of porridge, scraping it clean with a ladle that left trenches in the earth. This was not gluttony, but a display of his boundless capacity to consume and contain, a literal embodiment of abundance. He could be cunning in a crude, practical way, and his romantic pursuits were as vigorous as his feasting. This lack of aristocratic polish is precisely what made him foundational. He was the god you could imagine sitting beside at a fire, sharing a story and a roast. He represented the comforting, undeniable truths of existence, the need for food, safety, love, and laughter. In the cosmic order established after Mag Tuatha, while Lugh might be the brilliant king and Nuada the noble lord, the Dagda was the solid ground upon which they all stood. He was the good god because he ensured there was something to be good for, a world of plenty worth defending. His enduring presence asks us a simple question: what is true power if it cannot fill a bowl or heal a wound? But the battlefield's fury was not a force of blind destruction. It had a name and a terrifying intelligence. While the Dagda embodied the land's enduring strength, another deity represented its ruthless, transformative power. This was the Morrigan, a goddess so complex she could not be contained in a single form or a simple role. She was a triple being, a convergence of 3 essential and terrifying aspects: war, fate, and sovereignty. To call her merely a war goddess is to miss the profound depth of her purpose. She did not fight for glory or territory, but to enforce the inevitable turning of destiny's wheel. On the battlefield, she was a fury incarnate. Ancient texts describe her as washing the blood-soaked armor and weapons of warriors who were fated to die, a grim laundress preparing the doomed for their final appointment. Her presence was a storm of shrieks and wings, for she often took the form of a crow or raven, the bodibi, circling above the carnage. To hear her cry over a house at night was an omen of death, a chilling reminder that she saw the threads of life and could shear them with a thought. Yet her power was not limited to prophecy or terror. She was a master shapeshifter, moving between forms to test, to challenge, and to claim. In one famous tale, she approaches the Dagda himself before the great battle, not as a goddess, but as a young woman washing at a river ford. Here, she is the embodiment of the sovereignty of the land, and through their union, she transfers her power to him, ensuring his victory. In another moment, she might be an eel tripping a warrior in a stream, or a she-wolf harrying the flanks of a fleeing army. Every form served her ultimate goal to guide the outcome toward its destined conclusion. Her crucial role in the Second Battle of Mag Tuatha cemented this. She did not stand in the battle line with a spear. Instead, she moved through the ranks like a living curse, chanting a potent prophecy that sapped the strength of the Fomorians and filled the Tuatha Dé with relentless fury. She used her magic to steal the very might from the enemy champion, leaving him weak and vulnerable. In the aftermath, as the Dagda claimed the land, he found her again and joined with her, a sacred marriage of the land's protector and its fierce sovereign spirit. The Morrigan teaches us that in the Celtic world, true sovereignty, the right to rule the land, is not a gentle gift. It is a fierce contract, won through struggle and upheld by a willingness to face the darkest aspects of destiny. She is the reminder that creation and destruction are two sides of the same coin, and that every king, every god, must answer to the crow's sharp cry on the wind. The Morrigan's fierce sovereignty found its perfect counterbalance in a goddess of luminous creation. Brigid, daughter of the great Dagda, was not a deity of the battlefield but of the forge, the hearth, and the human spirit. Where her father represented the raw abundance of the land, Brigid shaped that raw material into the arts of civilization itself. She was a triple goddess, a single divine force manifesting in three radiant aspects as a poet, a healer, and a smith. This trinity was not a hierarchy but a circle, each facet feeding and refining the others. As a poet, she presided over Baz, the sacred fire of inspiration that flashed in the mind of a bard, giving birth to prophecy, history, and lore. As a healer, she watched over sacred wells and springs, her knowledge of herbs and rituals mending both body and spirit. And as a smith, she stood at the forge, transforming inert metal into tools, jewelry, and weapons, mastering the elemental fire that could both create and destroy. Her power was in this synthesis, showing that true civilization requires the inspiration of the poet, the compassion of the healer, and the skilled hand of the artisan. Her presence was so vital that she transcended the purely mythic age. When Christianity later came to Ireland, the goddess Brigid was seamlessly syncretized with Saint Brigid of Kildare. The saint inherited the goddess's attributes, her feast day coinciding with the pagan festival of Imbolc, and her monastery in Kildare famously tending an eternal sacred flame, a direct continuation of the goddess's fire. This remarkable fusion shows Brigid's profound and enduring role, not as a distant figure of legend, but as a living force woven into the very identity of the land. She was the exalted one, the life-giving and protective force that made the Tuatha Dé Danann's rule a golden age of culture, not just conquest. Under her patronage, the arts flourished, transforming their hard-won sovereignty into a legacy of beauty and wisdom. Yet even an age of poets and smiths cannot last forever, for a new sound was beginning to echo across the Irish Sea, the sound of mortal oars cutting through the water. The gods' golden age was a realm bounded not by shores but by a living, breathing mist, and its master was Manannán mac Lugh. If the Dagda was the heart of the land, then Manannán was the soul of the sea that encircled it, a deity of profound mystery and fluid boundaries. He was the son of the sea itself, Lugh, and his domain was everything the solid earth was not, shifting, deep, and cloaked in perpetual mystery. He ruled the rolling grey waves that kissed Ireland's coast, but his true kingdom was even more elusive, the shimmering, timeless paradise known as Tir na Og, the land of the young. This was not a place you could find on any map. It was an island or many islands hidden behind veils of enchanted fog, where sickness and old age were unknown and joy was as constant as the tide. Manannán was the ferryman and guardian of this eternal realm, the one who decided who could cross its threshold and who would be lost forever in the mists. His power was expressed not through brute strength, but through a collection of magical artifacts that defied the laws of the mortal world. Each item was a key to his liminal nature. He commanded a boat named Scuabtuin, the wave sweeper, that required no oar or sail, moving solely by the force of his will and thought. It could travel to any shore, in this world or the other, with impossible speed. For land travel, he rode a horse named Aenbha, whose galloping hooves did not touch the soil, but skimmed the crests of the waves as easily as the grassy plains. But perhaps his most iconic treasure was his cloak of invisibility, the Faith Fireter. When he draped it around his shoulders, he and anything he chose to conceal would vanish from sight, not just hidden but erased from the perception of the world. This cloak was more than a tool for trickery. It was the very essence of the mist he commanded, the tangible form of the boundary between the seen and the unseen. This made Manannán the ultimate liminal figure, a god who existed in the betweens. He stood at the threshold between the human world and the otherworld, between life and death, between the known and the unknowable. He was not a warrior who fought in the great battles, but a crucial ally who operated from the edges. When the Tuatha Dé Danann were later defeated by the mortal Milesians, it was Manannán who counseled them. He advised them to retreat not into exile but inward, to use their magic to slip beneath the green hills and barrows, to become the Owls She, the people of the mounds, living in a parallel, unseen Ireland. He divided the invisible realms among them and shrouded their dwellings with his mists. In this role, he was the preserver of magic, the one who ensured the gods did not vanish, but simply moved from one layer of reality to another, closer to the source of their power in Tir na and Og. His relationship with the Tuatha Dé was one of kinship and patronage, but always with an air of detached, oceanic wisdom. He was their uncle, their benefactor, and often their teacher in the deeper arts of illusion. He provided them with magical pigs that, when slaughtered, would be reborn the next day to be eaten again, ensuring eternal feasting. He was a god of abundance like the Dagda, but his was the abundance of the deep, unpredictable and shrouded. To encounter Manannán was to confront the fundamental mystery of the Celtic world, the understanding that reality had layers, and that the most powerful forces were often the ones you could not see, just beyond the next wave, or hidden in the fog rolling in from the western sea. He was the reminder that creation, for all its solid hills and fought-over plains, was forever surrounded and permeated by a vast, intelligent, and untamable unknown. Manannán's mists did more than hide a retreat, they preserved an entire reality. This is the Celtic Otherworld, a concept utterly distinct from the heavens or hells of later traditions. It was not a reward for the virtuous or a punishment for the wicked, but a parallel dimension of perfect existence, existing just beside our own, separated by the thinnest of veils. Its most famous manifestation is Tir na and Og, the land of the young, a place of breathtaking beauty where time itself held no sway. There, apple trees bore blossoms and ripe fruit simultaneously, flowers never wilted, and the inhabitants lived in a state of perpetual joy and vitality, free from sickness, old age, or sorrow. It was a realm of endless feasting, sublime music, and profound peace. But this paradise was not somewhere far above the clouds or deep below the earth. It was here, interwoven with the familiar landscape. The gateways to this eternal realm were the ancient grassy mounds that dotted the Irish countryside, the Shia. These were not random hills, but the hollowed-out dwelling places of the gods, portals to a world that existed inside the very land. When a hero in a tale stepped into a Shia mound, they did not descend into a dark cave, but entered a magnificent hall brighter than day, where a single night of feasting could translate to 100 years passing in the mortal world outside. This is the crucial link between the mythic age of the gods and the living folklore that followed. After their final, decisive defeat not by monsters but by mortal men, the Tuatha Dé Danann faced a choice. They could not be destroyed, for they were elemental forces given form, but they could no longer rule the surface in the open. So, guided by Manannán mac Lugh, they used their greatest magic. They did not flee or vanish. Instead, they gathered their power and withdrew. they stepped sideways through the veil of the world, retreating into the hollow hills, the very sheer mounds that were the doors to their otherworld kingdoms. In doing so, they underwent a profound transformation. From the glorious Tuatha Dé Danann, the tribe of the goddess, they became the Aus-She, the people of the mounds, or as later folklore would call them, the fairy folk. This was not a diminishment, but a change in relationship with the land and its new human inhabitants. They became the secret sovereigns, the unseen guardians of the wild places. Their palaces were now beneath the ancient thorn trees, inside the ring forts, and under the quiet green hills. Their time moved differently, and their moods directly influenced the fortune of the mortal world above. A farmer who respected their mounds and left offerings might find his cows gave more milk. One who foolishly built a fence across a ferry path might find his home plagued with ill luck. The great gods of battle and craft were now the hidden folk, the Shia, their mythic grandeur distilled into the potent, capricious, and deeply respected figures of folk tradition. Lugh, the sun god, might become the shining fairy king of a local mound. Brigid, the goddess of poetry and smithcraft, seamlessly evolved into the fairy woman who inspired poets or protected the hearth. The Morrigan's terrifying aspect softened into the banshee, the fairy woman whose wail outside a home foretold a death. This is the true, enduring legacy of the first Celtic gods. They never left, they simply moved into the layers of the world just beyond our sight, ensuring that every rustle in the forest, every trick of the light on a misty hill, and every strange piece of luck could be a whisper from the age when gods walked the land and magic was the law of the world. The final challenge to the gods' rule did not come from monsters but from men. After generations of peace under the Tuatha Dé Danann, a new fleet appeared on the eastern horizon, led by the mortal sons of Mil, the Milesians, the legendary ancestors of the Gaels. They were not magical beings, but they carried with them a different kind of power, a fierce and unwavering determination to claim this land as their birthright. Their arrival was the fifth and final great invasion in the mythic cycle, and it would change the nature of Ireland forever. When the Milesians made landfall, they were met not by an army, but by the three goddesses of sovereignty, Banba, Fodla, and Eru. Each goddess, in turn, asked that the island be named for her. The Milesian leaders, showing both respect and cunning, agreed to this request, honoring the ancient spirits of the land they sought to conquer. But the true rulers, the Tuatha Dé Danann, were watching. The gods, led by their king, confronted the mortals and issued a strange and fateful challenge. They demanded that the Milesians return to their ships and sail back out to sea, to a distance of 9 waves from the shore. If they could then land again against the Tuatha Dé's power, the kingdom would be theirs. It was a test of pure strength, pitting mortal will against divine magic. The Milesians agreed. They pushed their ships back into the rolling grey water, rowing hard until the green shore was a distant line and 9 great waves separated them from the beach. Then they turned, ready to fight their way to land. This is when the Tuatha Dé Danann unleashed their full might. They called upon the druids and poets of their tribe, masters of the magical arts. These poets began to chant, their voices rising over the crash of the sea. They sang spells of binding and chaos, weaving enchantments that stirred the very elements. In response, a supernatural storm erupted. The wind screamed not from the sky but from the lips of the gods. The waves, which moments before were a measure of distance, now reared up like mountains, crashing against the wooden hulls with impossible fury. The sea itself seemed to boil, and a dense, magical fog blinded the sailors. The Milesian fleet was scattered, thrown into chaos by a tempest born of song. For a moment, it seemed the gods' victory was absolute, but among the Milesians was their own chief poet, a man named Imogen. As the ships foundered, he stood on the storm-tossed deck and raised his own voice in a counter-chant, a song of profound connection. He called out to the spirit of Ireland itself, declaring his kinship with every rock, every wave, every living creature. His poem was not an attack, but a claim of belonging so deep it quieted the magical storm. The winds stilled, the waves settled, and the Milesians, battered but unbroken, made their way back to the shore. They landed and fought the Tuatha Dé Danann in a final, decisive battle on land. This time the gods could not prevail. Their magical storm had failed, and the relentless tide of mortal destiny could not be held back. Faced with defeat, the Tuatha Dé Danann made a world-altering choice. They would not be destroyed, for they were immortal, but they could no longer rule in the open. Using their greatest magic, they retreated. They gathered their luminous essence and withdrew from the surface of the land, slipping down into the hollow hills, the ancient burial mounds and barrows that dotted the landscape. They became the Aos-Shi, the people of the mounds, leaving the world above to the sons of Mil. Human dominion over Ireland began on that day, but the age of the gods did not end. It simply moved into the hills beneath your feet and the mist just beyond the corner of your eye. Their defeat was not a surrender, but a negotiation. The Milesians, victorious on the field, now faced the profound reality that they had not conquered a mere enemy army, but the very spirits of the land itself. A final, binding agreement was forged, one that would define the spiritual geography of Ireland for all time to come. The pact was stark in its division, yet brilliant in its balance. The Tuatha Dé Danann, the divine tribe, would withdraw from the sunlit surface world. Their new kingdom would be the underground, the hollow hills known as the Shia Mounds, and the shimmering, parallel dimension of the Otherworld that lay just beyond the thinnest of veils. In return, the Milesians, the mortal sons of Mil, would claim the world above, the green plains, the forests, and the coastlines to farm, to build, and to rule as human kings. This was not a banishment to some dark, distant underworld. It was a lateral move into a realm of equal, if not greater, power and splendor, simply hidden from mortal eyes. The gods did not vanish, they inverted. They became the secret sovereigns, the unseen architects of fortune and fate, their palaces now lying beneath the very soil the humans walked upon. This agreement established the foundational principle of Irish belief, a permanent and intimate coexistence of the divine and mortal realms. The world became layered. The surface was the domain of day-to-day life, of harvest and history governed by human law. But below, in a network of luminous halls and timeless landscapes, the Tuatha Dé Danann continued their eternal feasts, their magic undiminished. They transformed in the folk consciousness into the Aos-Shi, the people of the mounds, or what later tradition would simply call the fairies. This term, however, carries a modern lightness that betrays their true nature. These were not tiny, whimsical creatures. They were the gods themselves, now operating from the shadows, their power condensed into a more localized, yet still formidable, presence. Their influence was direct and constant. A farmer who respected their territory, who left a corner of his field untilled or an offering of milk at a hawthorn tree, might find his crops flourishing. A poet who slept on a certain Shia mound might wake with the gift of Imbaz, a flash of divine inspiration. Conversely, to foolishly damage a ferry fort, to cut down a sacred tree, or to build across a ferry path was to invite calamity, sour milk, sick livestock, or a sudden, mysterious stroke of bad luck. The gods became the explanation for the uncanny, the guardians of the wild places, and the arbiters of a moral compact with the land itself. They were the reason why some hills felt watchful, why some springs healed, and why some mists seemed to hide more than just the far shore. This division created a world alive with invisible consequence, where every human action on the surface had a potential reaction from the world below. The king who ruled at Tara held his crown not just by human consent, but by the tacit allowance of the hidden ones whose mounds dotted his kingdom. The agreement ensured that while humans owned the land, they would never truly be its sole masters. The first gods had been forced to retreat, but in doing so, they became the enduring, whispered heartbeat of the island, a constant reminder that what you see is only half of the story. The pact with the Milesians did not erase the gods from the land, it etched them deeper into its very bones. Their stories did not end with their retreat beneath the hills, they became the reason the hills exist at all. In the Celtic imagination, creation was not a single event that happened long ago. It is an ongoing conversation between the mythic past and the living present, written in stone and water. Every mountain, lake, and river holds a memory of the divine drama that shaped it, turning the entire island into a vast, open-air library of legend. The landscape itself is the oldest manuscript, and its pages are the rolling plains and jagged coastlines. Consider the largest lake in these islands, Lugh. Its vast, peat-stained waters did not form from rainfall alone. One of the oldest tales says it was dug by the mighty Fionn mac Cumhaill, a later hero of the Fenian cycle, in a fit of rage. He tore a great chunk of earth from the ground to hurl at a rival in Scotland, and the crater he left behind filled with water to become the Lugh. The piece of earth itself became the Isle of Man, resting in the Irish Sea. This story connects geography to emotion, a literal landmark born from a giant's fury, but the gods themselves left even more profound marks. Look to the River Boyne, one of Ireland's most sacred waterways. Its name comes from the goddess Bone, and its course was carved by her daring and her tragedy. Bone was married to the stern druid Nechtan, guardian of a sacred well that held the source of all wisdom. The well was surrounded by a taboo. No one but Nechtan and his cupbearers could approach it, for its waters were too powerful. Driven by curiosity or perhaps a divine need to know, Bone challenged this prohibition. She walked around the well 3 times, counter to the sun's direction, breaking the magic. In response, the waters of the well rose up in a furious, chasing wave. They pursued her, sweeping her along as she ran in desperation. The torrent carved a path across the land, following her every step until it finally reached the sea. This rushing water became the River Boyne, and Bone, consumed by the knowledge she had unleashed, became one with its current. Her story explains the river's origin, yes, but it does more. It encodes a warning about forbidden knowledge and the price of defiance, and it sanctifies the river as a goddess made manifest, a flow of wisdom and consequence across the land. Even the mountains tell tales of conflict. The Mountains of Mourne, those sweeping granite peaks that sweep down to the sea in County Down, are said to be the burial place of the giantess Bwach. Some say she was a cow goddess whose herds grazed the slopes, and the mountains were raised over her resting form. Others whisper that the mournful, beautiful landscape reflects an older sorrow, a grief so deep it shaped the earth itself. This is the essence of mythic geography. A mountain range is not just rock pushed up by tectonic plates, it is a giantess's final repose. A river is not just water finding the path of least resistance, it is a goddess fleeing the very source of understanding. A lake is not just a depression in the earth, it is the scar of a hero's thrown tantrum, a permanent reminder of a moment of colossal passion. This perspective transforms a simple journey across Ireland into a walk through a storybook. The land is alive with narrative. That low, rounded hill on the horizon is not just a hill, it is a Shia mound, a doorway to the otherworld where the Tuatha Dé Danann still feast. That cluster of stones in a field is not a random arrangement. It is the remains of a fortress from the Fir Bolg, or perhaps a place where the Morrigan stood to chant her prophecies. The roar of the sea against the cliffs is not just water and wind, it is the lingering echo of the Fomorian tide being driven back by the gods. This ongoing creation means the mythology is never truly finished. Every new generation that looks at the Mountains of Mourne and feels their solemn beauty is, in a way, participating in the myth of Bwach. Every traveler who stands beside the Boyne and wonders at its steady, powerful flow is hearing the last whispers of Bone's desperate run. The land remembers, and by remembering, it continues to create the stories that define a people. The first gods may live under the hills, but their greatest monument is the world above, sculpted by their deeds and forever whispering their names on the wind. This constant conversation between the land and its stories reveals a deeper philosophy. The Celtic worldview was not a linear march from a beginning to an end, but a great turning wheel. Time itself moved in cycles, mirroring the seasons, and this rhythm is etched into the very structure of their mythology. The 6 successive invasions in the Book of Invasions are not a random list, they are the heartbeat of this belief. Each wave arrives, flourishes for a time, and is inevitably displaced by the next, just as spring gives way to summer, then autumn, then winter, before the cycle begins anew. There is no permanent victory, no eternal empire. The Tuatha Dé Danann displace the Fir Bolg and are themselves displaced by the Milesians. This is not seen as a tragedy, but as the natural order of existence, a cosmic pattern of renewal. Even their gods were subject to this law, forced to retreat and transform rather than being utterly destroyed. This cyclical perspective fostered a profound respect for the past, not as something dead and gone, but as a layer just beneath the surface, constantly informing the present. The ancestors and the old gods were not vanished, they were simply in another phase of the same eternal turn. Binding this cyclical world together was an unbreakable web of kinship called fine in Old Irish. Your identity, your safety, and your very honor were rooted in your family and your tribe. This was more than just blood relation, it was a sacred contract of mutual obligation. The myths are filled with these bonds. The Tuatha Dé Danann are literally the tribe of the goddess Danu, their power and unity drawn from that shared lineage. When one of their kings, Nuada, is maimed, the entire tribe faces a crisis of leadership because the king embodies the health of the people. Conversely, the disastrous reign of Brez shows what happens when kinship is betrayed, when a ruler favors his Fomorian kin over the tribe that raised him to power. This value extends to the heroes of later cycles like Cuchulainn, whose most ferocious battle rages are sparked by the killing of a kinsman or the breaking of a tribal oath. Your word was your bond, and your honor was the currency of your soul. To be without honor was to be a non-person cast out from the protective web of fine. This honor was most visibly upheld through sacred contracts and solemn taboos. The most important contract was between the king and the land itself. A true king was not a tyrant, but a partner with the sovereignty of Ireland, often represented by a goddess like Eriu. His justice, his courage, and his generosity directly influenced the fertility of the soil and the prosperity of the people. A king who was blemished like Nuada with his lost arm, or corrupt like Brez with his stinginess, would cause the cows to go dry and the crops to fail. His rule became literally unsustainable. Alongside these royal contracts with a personal jisa, a jays was a magical prohibition or a sacred vow placed upon a hero, often from birth. It could be something seemingly simple, like never to eat the meat of a dog or never to refuse hospitality. But to break one's jays was to invite cosmic disaster, unraveling one's destiny. These were not arbitrary rules, they were the personalized threads of fate, the unique conditions under which a person's power and luck would hold. To honor your jisa was to maintain your place in the delicate balance of the world. Ultimately, all these threads, the cycles, the kinship, and the sacred vows, weave together into a single, overarching principle, a relationship with the land that was not ownership but reciprocity. The earth was not a resource to be exploited, but a living, conscious entity, a mother and a sovereign. Every hill, river, and forest had its own spirit, its own memory. The myths teach this again and again. The goddess Eriu demands her name be upon the island. The river Boyne is the transformed goddess Bone. When the Milesians arrive, they do not conquer the land by force alone. They first negotiate with its divine spirits, agreeing to share it with the hidden people of the mounds. This is the philosophical heart of the Celtic creation story. Creation did not happen once. It is a continuous, respectful dialogue. The world is alive, listening and responding. To live well within it required observing its cycles, honoring your place within the kinship of all things, and keeping your word sacred. The myths are not just entertaining tales of gods and monsters. They are the ancient blueprint for existing in a world that is forever watching, forever remembering, and forever turning its great green wheel. That great green wheel of myth never stopped turning. The retreat of the Tuatha Dé Danann beneath the hills was not an ending, but the beginning of their most enduring transformation. From the glorious, named gods of the mythological cycle, they evolved into the mysterious and potent beings of folk belief, the Aos-Shi, the people of the mounds. In the daily lives of farmers and villagers across Ireland and Scotland, these were not distant figures from a bard's epic, but immediate, capricious neighbors. They were the fairy folk, a term that softens their true, formidable nature. To offend them was to risk everything. A farmer who plowed over a fairy ring of mushrooms might find his best cow suddenly sick. A family foolish enough to build their cottage on a fairy path, an invisible road between sheer mounds, would be plagued by strange noises, lost objects, and relentless bad luck. Respect, however, was met with a cautious reciprocity. Leaving a saucer of milk on the doorstep at night, or refusing to cut down a lone hawthorn tree in a field, were acts of quiet diplomacy with the hidden sovereigns of the land. This folklore preserved the core attributes of the old gods, distilling their power into localized, personal encounters. The Morrigan's terrifying aspect lived on in the Banshee, the fairy woman whose mournful wail outside a home signaled an impending death in the family. Lugh's radiant skill could be seen in the tales of the fairy shoemaker who crafted impossibly fine goods. Bridget's nurturing flame was kept alive in the traditions of St. Bridget's Day. The gods had become woven into the fabric of everyday caution and wonder, their mythic scale translated into a language of hearth and field. This living folklore, in turn, became a wellspring for a new kind of poetry and prose. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, during the Irish literary revival, writers like W.B. Yeats and Lady Gregory did not merely collect these stories, they drank from them as a source of national identity and artistic rebirth. Yeats, in particular, was obsessed with the Aos-Shi. He saw them not as childish fantasies, but as serious, metaphysical realities, the remnants of the old divine order. His poems and plays are filled with figures like the Shia riding on the wind, with heroes stolen away to Tir Na and Og, and with the melancholy beauty of a world that is always fading from sight. In works like The Stolen Child or The Land of Heart's Desire, he captured the haunting allure and the genuine danger of the fairy realm, echoing the ancient pact that divided the world. He understood that the Otherworld was not a place of escape, but a realm of alternative truths, often more severe and beautiful than our own. This literary revival repackaged the Celtic mythic imagination for a modern audience, proving its themes were not archaic but timeless. That timelessness now fuels global imagination. The core concepts born from these ancient Irish myths have become foundational pillars of modern fantasy literature and film. The idea of a hidden, magical world existing parallel to our own, accessible through portals like ancient mounds or forgotten wardrobes, is a direct descendant of the Celtic Otherworld. The enchanted, talking forests of fantasy epics breathe with the same spirit as the forests the Tuatha Dé Danann would have known. More concretely, the four treasures of the Tuatha Dé have countless echoes. A sword that must be drawn only for justice, a cauldron of endless plenty, a spear of unstoppable power, a stone that confirms a king's rightful rule. These are the archetypal magical artifacts. You can see their lineage in the one ring that must be destroyed, in the sorting hat that chooses destinies, in the lightsabers of a more technological mythology, and in the countless quests for grails and talismans that fill our books and screens. The Celtic framework provided a blueprint where magic is inherent to the landscape, where the past is a living, palpable layer beneath the present, and where the moral universe is governed by sacred Jisa and the unbreakable bonds of kinship and honor. So the legacy of the first Celtic gods is not locked in a medieval manuscript. It is a continuous thread stretching from the primal void before creation, through the battle cries on Mag Tuatha, into the whispered warnings of grandmothers about fairy forts, onto the pages of Yeats's poetry, and out into the sprawling realms of contemporary fantasy. Their power endures because they answer a deep human need for a world that is more than it seems, for a landscape that remembers, and for stories that remind us that wonder is often hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for us to know how to look. That whispering thread of myth leads us to the end of one story and the beginning of all others. From the silent, dark sea of the primordial void to the final, shimmering retreat into the Shea Mounds, the Celtic creation narrative unfolds not as a single act but as a complex, breathing tapestry. Its patterns are woven with threads of invasion and displacement, of cataclysmic conflict and hard-won compromise. We have walked with the first gods, from the generous, anchoring strength of the Dagda to the brilliant, multifaceted radiance of Lugh. We witnessed them shape a world with magic and treasure, fight for its soul against the formless chaos of the Fomorians, and ultimately broker a profound pact that divided reality itself. Their withdrawal was not a disappearance but a transformation, a decision to become the hidden heartbeat of the land they loved. Their mark is everywhere, not just in the names of rivers and hills, but in the very way we imagine wonder. They gave us the blueprint for the enchanted forest just beyond the known path, the noble quest for a sacred artifact, and the haunting idea that the past is not gone but sleeping beneath a green hill. This mythology asks us to listen to the landscape, to feel the weight of a promise, and to remember that every ending is simply a turn in a much older, grander cycle. So now we pass the story to you. Was it the Morrigan's fierce sovereignty, Lugh's masterful skill, or the Dagda's comforting abundance that captured your imagination? Perhaps a different deity or tale from this rich world resonates most. Share your favorite in the comments below and let the conversation continue. For more journeys into the heart of ancient stories, be sure to subscribe.